introduction as well. So I actually met Athena as an undergraduate student. So she was one of those precocious undergraduate students we all wish we had at the University of Pennsylvania. And she'd encountered multi-level selection and was excited by it, but she wasn't getting much love about it from her faculty advisors. So she reached out to me, and together we started to educate the faculty at the University of Pennsylvania. At least that's how I think of it. And ever since, we've been crossing paths, and Athena's gone on to an amazing career. And I think she illustrates this view of life, basically, the transcendent, disciplinary, spanning property of evolutionary theory. She's world-renowned for studying cancer from an evolutionary perspective, from a multi-level perspective, has done very important theoretical work on multi-level selection, including something called a walkaway model, and retains an interest in human cooperation, does all of this at ASU, gifted communicator with her zombie podcast, a lot of fun, a salsa dancer, and someone who actually gamified teaching game theory, gamifying game theory in a way that I use in my own classes. And so of all of these things, she could have picked a lot of things to talk about. And Athena, you've chosen to talk about adaptation to risk in small-scale societies. So that's super interesting. And I'll turn it over to you. And then I'm all ears.
Well, first of all, David, thank you for that extremely generous introduction, overly generous introduction, and for being such a wonderful mentor to me, like a sort of, shadow mentor, like throughout my whole academic student life, and even, beyond now, as a faculty member. I really, I'm grateful for that, and for, there's something about like interacting with somebody who is sort of outside of your academic, your small academic world when you're a student, who gives you that kind of encouragement that you might not be getting from like the main, world that you're in. And I really, I'm grateful to you for that throughout these decades. So thanks so much. And thanks for inviting me to give this talk. I'm really excited to share some of this work with all of you, and I'll look forward to having some time to chat about it as well. It seems like, since it's not a huge group, that if there are things that come up that you want to talk about even as I go, if you want to interject, I'm very happy to have it be a little bit more conversational and not have me just kind of monologue for 40 minutes and then stop and discuss. Okay. So I'll just invite that. And yeah, I'll go ahead and start sharing my slides. I
think if we use our raise hand function, that will appear on the column, and you'll go to the top of the column with your raised hands, and we can do it that way.
Sounds great. Sounds great. All right. So yeah, I'm going to be talking about risk and managing risk in small scale societies. And really, this is a talk that is essentially about cooperation and generosity, and how generosity kind of can function to really help human groups manage large challenges, catastrophic kinds of challenges, uncertainties. And I've been doing this work for a number of decades. And I'll kind of like situate it for you guys a little bit kind of in my broader arena. So my big interest really is, how does cooperation scale up from sort of small scale interactions like you have among a few humans or among a few cells? How do those scale up to societies, whether we're talking about societies of humans, right? Or we're talking about societies of cells, like the multicellular bodies that we are, right? Because we're made of 30 trillion cells that are cooperating and coordinating to make us function, which is totally astounding if you really stop for a minute and think about it, right? It's like kind of mind-blowing that you're made of 30 trillion, essentially, independent decision-making entities, right? That are expressing genes and changing their receptors and their electrical signaling and all of that, that somehow makes us function. But really, we are each sort of this paragon of unbelievable cooperation, which of course has been able to evolve because of multi-level selection, right? Because you had selection on the level of the organism, right? The group of cells for so long that you have functionality at that level. So, when it comes to sort of looking at scaling up of multicellular life to the kinds of entities that we have now, like humans, a lot of my interest in that is understanding cancer as sort of a breakdown of cellular cooperation. But then also, in order to understand that, you have to sort of consider, well, what needed to happen for cooperation to scale up in that way. So no matter whether we're looking at cells or humans and societies or social insects or any entities really that scale that cooperation up, we have to consider sort of what are the benefits that come from scaling up those groups, and then what are the challenges that come, right? And the challenges, the main challenge that I think is the one that has to be solved to even sort of get off the ground is this challenge of detecting and suppressing cheating, if it arises. And that has to be solved to a certain extent in order to get some of those benefits that come from producing public goods that can be shared, having economies of scale, dividing labor, managing risk effectively, all of that. So basically, you want to scale up because you can get some benefits. There's some challenges that you need to overcome to do that. And my big interest is what are the kind of general principles that underlie this kind of scaling up of cooperation. So what I'll mostly be talking about today is human sharing and the Human Generosity Project. But as David mentioned, I also work on cancer as a breakdown of multicellular cooperation. I work on actually looking at kombucha as a multi-species cooperation system, where you have bacteria and yeast that are actually working together to manage risk, which I could talk about as a whole other talk. So if you want to have me back sometime to talk about kombucha, I'd be very happy to. And then kind of using this idea of sort of genetic conflict and the extended phenotype to think a little bit differently about human behavior and also sort of evolutionary medicine by talking about zombies as sort of, these entities that are taken over by things that have different genetic interests from them, that are genetically different from them. So, and that then ties in kind of with a lot of my science communication stuff. So sort of looking at the conflict and cooperation and evolutionary medicine through those more playful lenses. I want to give you kind of like a little bit of background here. So David mentioned this walkaway strategy that was part of my graduate work. And this was basically an agent-based model, of course, sort of an n-player prisoner's dilemma game or a public goods game, where agents could invest or not in their group. And then agents could leave groups that were not cooperative enough. And essentially what I found is that if you have just a very simple leaving rule that, if you don't have above a certain threshold of cooperators, you leave as an agent, then that can lead to a lot of positive assortment. So cooperators preferentially interacting with other cooperators, which can lead to having cooperation be viable under a pretty wide range of parameters. And you actually get this sort of very interesting, very simple, but very interesting pattern where groups that have more cooperators have higher payoffs, which make them more stable. Groups that have lower payoffs, who have fewer cooperators have lower payoffs, which makes them less stable. And then this leads to a metapopulation structure where individuals that cooperate are more likely to be in groups with other cooperators and more likely to get more benefits. And then they're able to survive and thrive that way. And so the red individuals here represent the defectors, the blue ones, the cooperators. Even if you start with 95% defectors, over a few tens of thousands of time periods, you end up with mostly cooperators. And there's a really interesting kind of shift here. It happens in the population where it starts with almost 100% movement rate, migration rate. Individuals are leaving, they're moving and they're not staying in one place. And then as you get that positive assortment, the proportion of cooperators starts to go up, which then leads the migration rate to go down, group size and the number of groups go up, and you get almost this sort of like regime shift in the population. And then what you have sort of in this later stage is a structure where you have, some groups that are staying together for, they stay together for as long as, as long as they're not getting invaded by defectors, and then they get invaded by defectors, they break up, they form subgroups, and then you have this sort of really cool dynamic process, which may map on to the kinds of things that were possible for our human ancestors to do, who were hunter-gatherers, who had camp structures where they were able to have quite a bit of autonomy over where they lived and where they didn't. And so this was kind of where I started with a lot of my work on the evolution of cooperation. Now, one thing though, when it comes to, I'll stay here for a minute. When it comes to thinking about how would larger scale cooperation evolve, with the walkaway rule, you have to have some mechanism that allows individuals to sort of leave and then find new groups. And the metapopulation structure that you have here requires kind of ongoing movement. So this is one very sort of simple rule that allows you to get cooperation, but it doesn't necessarily allow you to scale it up for groups specifically. You can scale it up to have a large metapopulation, but it's not a solution, for example, that could work for building a big multicellular body, right? Because the cells would have to kind of go all in. So, part of my sort of interest in walk away, it's it's a solution that can kind of fit for some kinds of systems, but it can't necessarily scale up cooperation all the way. I see that there are some questions in the chat, so I'm going to go over to here right now. Kombucha in the Q&A, absolutely. Yes, lots of walkaways. Cool. Anybody want to jump in with anything verbally, or we good? If you're trying to talk, Andy, you're on mute.
Yeah. Thanks, Athena. Have you looked at all at how walkaway interacts with reciprocity and inclusive fitness, to kind of the role it plays relative to those in the evolution of cooperation?
So in order to kind of put them on the same platform, to compare them to each other, you'd have to make a bunch of assumptions. And in this model, agents are extremely simple. So, they only really have a few characteristics that are evolving. They don't have a whole genome, and they're not having offspring in a realistic environment and stuff like that. I do have a model that includes sort of, mating and reproduction in a realistic way, where it might be able to bring walkaway into it. But honestly, I haven't put all of those things into one model.
It'd be interesting to look at how they help scaffold each other, right? And
sure, yeah, and and if there's any, as you might assume that there's some genetic basis for a sort of willingness to tolerate or not a bad social situation. That's certainly a trait that selection could act on as well. And I actually have some results. I don't have them in here, and they're not published yet, but if you let that trait of this threshold evolve, that gives you cooperation like much more quickly, and like asymptotically high levels of cooperation, because everybody just evolves to be, more and more selective as everybody becomes more and more cooperative. So
Fascinating. Thank you.
cool. All right. So let's jump into talking about the Human Generosity Project. So this project, we're looking basically around the world at many different field sites. And we started with the Maasai in East Africa, looking at Osotwa as kind of a cooperative system. It's the Maasai of East Africa basically have been using this Osotwa system to manage risk for, as far back as their history goes. And Osotwa is essentially a cultural, but also has sort of like religious tones to it, system of sharing in times of need. This Fijians that we study in Yasawa Irara on the sort of tip of Fiji, they have a system called Keri Keri. It's actually a system that is throughout Fiji. It is also a system where people help each other in times of need. Central place food sharing, we see that in the Hadza we've studied, but also in many other societies that do hunting and gathering, where they will forage, and they'll eat as they're foraging, and then anything extra they'll bring back to the central place and share it with others. In New Mexico and in Arizona, we actually have a field site here where we are looking at a practice called neighboring, which is essentially ranchers helping other ranchers who are living essentially as modern day cowboys. And neighboring has a lot of these similar features of helping in times of need. Tomorrow Marang is a practice that is used by the Ik in Uganda, and it is really the same thing. It is a helping, individuals helping each other in times of need. So with the Human Generosity Project, we have a number of goals. These are sort of the three main ones. So documenting these sharing systems across small scale societies, doing research in the lab and in the field that's empirical to understand why and how people are engaging in these need-based transfers, and then creating simulations to look at how viable need-based transfers are and how they fare against other kinds of transfer rules. We also work a lot on communicating with the public and with other scientists about our results. And then I'm really intrigued by sort of what the implications are of need-based transfers for understanding the evolution both of human sociality and major transitions in evolution, and also in the evolution of life, because it turns out that need-based transfers are a very ubiquitous thing. They're not just something that happens in human societies, but they happen in animal societies. They even happen among cells. And finally, applying this work to practical problems. So how can this help us to make our societies more resilient in the face of disasters or other large-scale risks? So let's talk for a minute about kind of where this project started with the Maasai of East Africa. So the Maasai are East African pastoralists, and they live in the Great Rift Valley, which is characterized by ecological variation. So, if I have my livestock higher up and yours are lower down, we might experience sort of very different environments in terms of the availability of water and the weather, and that leads to the possibility for individuals to have these relationships that can help them manage risk, because not everybody's always experiencing the same thing at the same time. Now, some of the challenges that they can face include having just variation in the growth of their herds. If you have more females or more males, or just, by luck, you might have a lot of calves one year and not another. Drought can also seriously affect the viability of herds, as can diseases. And at least historically, theft was not uncommon. Raiding occurred. Today, that's not so much, but the Osotwa system was really developed through a time when there was raiding from neighboring groups.
And
Now,
Athena, the Maasai probably themselves did raiding, is that right?
So they have now, not really actively, but you know, as with many societies, the Maasai believe that you know, they have basically like they believe all the cows in the world belong to Maasai. So
Yeah.
you know, it's like so for them it's not stealing, which, you know, is interesting if you think about it. I think there are a lot of societies that basically will approach like, oh, but all the land belongs to us, or all of this belongs to us, so it's not stealing, right? It's like a mindset. But it's not as much an issue anymore. Raiding has been all but eliminated in East Africa. So not eliminated, but it's much less of a problem than it was before. So if we break down what Osotwa is, it's characterized by these two main rules. Basically, you should only ask when you are genuinely in need. And if you're asked and you have enough that you're able to give, then you give. And what Osotwa means actually in Maasai, in Ma, the Ma language, is umbilical cord. And so it's the word that they're using is really a kin term, you could say, and it's a term of a transfer, you know, from an individual that has resources to an individual that needs resources, and specifically, you know, one that is unidirectional, where there really, you know, isn't an expectation that like you know, the baby is going to pay you back, right? So they're invoking this metaphor, which really is a kin metaphor. And like I mentioned with Osotwa, there's no expectation of return. Then interestingly, when they translated the Bible into Ma, they used the word Osotwa to mean testament as well. So that gives you a sense of just how heavy kind of this concept of Osotwa is. It is a sort of a sacred bond, and one where individuals help without expecting anything back. I often get this question of, well, you know, well, how do you really know that they're not expecting to get paid back? Like maybe they're kind of expecting to get paid back in one way or another. Well, the reason that we know is because if you ask the Maasai about Osotwa and, you know, well, would you expect to get paid back if you helped under the system? They say, no, we wouldn't. But if we gave in the Sile system, then we would expect to get paid back. So they have a separate system that is for debt and credit. And Osotwa is not for debt and credit. Osotwa is for helping that is conditional on need. So let me tell you a little bit about some of the models that I put together. And this is in collaboration with Lee Cronk, who's an anthropologist who has studied the Maasai for decades. And he's the one who originally discovered that Osotwa was not a system of reciprocity because of some experimental economics games that he did a while ago back. So basically what we did was my colleagues and this grad student that we were working with looked in the literature for sort of what the ecological conditions were for East African pastoralists vis-a-vis their herds, how many cows you needed to sustain a family, et cetera, et cetera. And then I used all of those parameters to create a model where you have herds that grow, potential disaster striking, then the agents can make requests, fulfill requests, and then the system sort of checks to see what herds are viable at that point. And so this is one of our initial findings, where essentially we found that the Osotwa strategy did better than probabilistic strategies that were yoked to the same likelihood of giving, the same sort of magnitude of giving, but we're just not conditional in the same way that Osotwa is. And essentially what we found is that you get this sort of long tail of survival on the, on this bottom heat map, where if you have pairs that are both using the Osotwa strategy, you can get very, very sort of long tails of survival for both parties. And what we see is that there's something special about the fit between the asking rule and the giving rule that is really doing the work that gets you that increased survival. Because if you have just probabilistic asking and Osotwa giving, or just Osotwa asking and probabilistic giving, it's as good as no exchange or probabilistic exchange. So you need to have that matching of the giving and asking rule together to get that benefit.
So Athena,
Yes.
what prevents it from being exploited? Why is it,
Well-
why is it not invadable?
Yeah, maybe we can circle back to that question in like 5 or 10 minutes after I show some more data, if that's
Sure.
all right. Great.
Sure.
So yeah, so then we looked at well, I added in debt-based rules too, because I was curious, well, how does this perform in comparison to agents that are sort of keeping track of debt and credit and are not interacting with partners who don't pay them back, et cetera. And so here we have the results when you have debt-based players playing together, and you have need-based players playing together and no transfers. And again, you see this long tail with the need-based transfers, but you do get some slightly better performance with debt-based transfers than with no transfers. So basically, if the individuals are giving each other loans, you get some management of risk going on, but it's not nearly as good. You don't get that long tail that you do with the need-based transfers. You can also look here at the inequality of wealth, and by looking at the Gini coefficients, and what you find is that you have the much greater wealth equality with need-based transfers than with debt-based transfers or no transfers. Now, you might ask, well, what happens if you have a need-based player and a debt-based player playing with each other? What does that look like? And here, these are the average survival for agents that are playing need-based together, debt-based together, or one and the other. And what we see, very interestingly, it's a coordination game, which is also sometimes called a stag hunt game, where the payoffs for playing both as debt-based players are relatively low, 25. The payoffs for playing need-based are relatively high. They're 30 and 30. But if your partner, so let's say you're playing debt-based and your partner is playing need-based, you as a debt-based player can do better than your partner. You can get 29.5. You can't do actually as well as if you were both playing need-based, right? So there's no incentive, really, there's no incentive at all to play debt-based if even if you think your partner is going to be whatever you think your partner is going to be doing. You really just don't want to move from one of those coordination points, right? If you're both playing debt-based, then you take a risk by moving to need-based if you don't coordinate with your partner to do that at the same time. So I think this is also really interesting because it suggests that it's pretty simple to solve this sort of dilemma of, do you play need-based or debt-based, just with a little bit of communication or some framing, right? That tells you, oh, we're playing this kind of game or that kind of game. And so it's interesting that the Maasai, right, they have terms, right? Like it's sile or it's osotwa, which might help them to coordinate for the kinds of transactions they're having, really which square they're in. So just to kind of summarize and bring it together a little bit here, what we have is a situation where you have individuals that make a request to sort of get themselves to the threshold that they need to be able to survive. And then individuals respond by giving as much as they can without going below their own threshold for what they need. And then what you get is limited risk pooling, and that leads to better survival for all involved parties. And so you can think about need-based transfers as a limited risk pooling system that can really help to limit losses. And it's a limited risk pooling system because there's a limit to how much you have to give, right? You don't have to go all in and give more than what you can sort of afford to do while keeping yourself okay. So it's limited in that sense. And it's also a risk pooling system, not a resource pooling system. It's a risk pooling because what you're pooling is the cost that comes from having something bad happen. You're not actually putting resources into a common pool. You're pooling that risk instead. So if we look across these societies that we've studied in the Human Generosity Project, we see that these social risk management strategies are they're really widespread, and we really saw them in every society that we looked at. The one society where we didn't see as many examples of need-based transfers was the Darhat in Mongolia, but that was because the main need that they have is surviving through these very difficult winters. And what they're doing is they're helping each other in advance to prepare, rather than helping each other when the need is acute. Because when there's feet of snow, they can't go to help each other. They're all they have to hunker down for the winter. So that's sort of an interesting example where people are proactively really working together to manage risk. Now, you might be wondering at this point, well, are these need-based transfer systems, well, actually, before I move on to this, David, let me return back to your question briefly about, sort of what keeps this system stable. And I'll briefly answer that, and then I'll point you to some other studies, because I don't think I'm going to look and see ahead if I have the studies in here.
I'm guessing, Athena,
yes.
that there's probably some pretty strong norms which would
If
somebody pulls the trigger on this inappropriately, then that's not going to go well for them, probably.
Yeah, so there are strong norms, and we have studied this as well. I don't have the slides in here. I should put them in. So if you allow for people to hide their wealth. So we've done some online studies where people are basically playing a resource management game, and they can hide their wealth or not, that they're more likely to ask when they're not in need and refuse to give even if they're able. So having wealth be visible is a really big piece of, we think, of what keeps the system stable in small scale societies, because everybody can see how much everybody else has. If you try to cheat, everybody knows you're cheating. Among the Maasai, I talked about sort of the two rules of Osotwa, right? Ask it if you're in need, only if you're in need, and give if you're asked and able. But they also have some other sort of norms that come along with Osotwa, some rules that come along with it. Basically, you could think of them as the 3 R's: respect, responsibility, and restraint. So you should be respectful to those in your community. You should be behave with responsibility towards your herds. Take good care of them, not let them get sick. So that sort of avoids moral hazard. And restraint. So not slaughtering a bunch of cows just to have a party for no reason, or things like that. So there's these expectations that come along with being a part of Maasai society, and in many of these other societies as well. There are strong norms, and wealth is visible, which makes it a lot harder for that cheating to happen.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's talk about what happens in modern Western environment. So a former grad student of mine, Jessica Ayers, who is now a professor at University Boise, she did a study looking at what are people's expectations about how they feel like their friends should behave. What rules do people expect their friends to follow? And interestingly, what she found, if you just sort of rank how important people rated these various rules that people could follow or not during friendship, helps me when I'm in need was one of the very top ones. And all the way at the bottom was always pays me back when they owe me. So to us, this is suggesting that, when it comes to close friendships, our expectations really are that they will have much more of a sort of need-based helping kind of character than a debt-based helping kind of character. Now let's turn our attention to the Southwest US here, New Mexico, Arizona, here where I am. We have had the chance to look at how does the unpredictability of various kinds of needs that can arise, how does that affect people's expectations about whether repayment should occur or not? And so essentially what we did was we had ranchers rank 10 different types of need that can arise during their work, while they're working or trying to manage their ranches, from very unpredictable to very unpredictable. And then we had them rank those same things in terms of what they expect in return, whether it's nothing or money or the same kind of help. And what we found was that as the predictability went up, people's expectation of getting repaid went up. But for things that were very unpredictable, like having an illness or death or an injury, or even an equipment failure where, there's an element of that really is just chance, that when people gave help in those situations, they didn't expect to get paid back. While for things that were very predictable, they expected the same kind of help in return. Like, for example, if I go and help you during your branding days, I'll expect you to do the same for me. And then this was a sort of pseudo replication of this, but with an online sample where we asked people sort of the same kinds of things. So, how predictable are these various needs? And about getting repaid or not. And if you kind of group in your head the gray and the brown bars, those are the sort of not expecting to get repaid or expecting to get the same kind of help if the need arises, right? So that's our need-based transfer sort of expectation, is those two bars. You'll see that as as things become more unpredictable, their expectation is a much more of a need-based transfer kind of expectation, that you don't expect anything back, or sort of all you expect is that if you're in the same kind of help, or if you're in the same kind of need, that you will get helped by them. Then we also did a game where we had people managing a resource, and then they read a sort of story about au sautoir. No, not a story, really, is a description about au sautoir, or a description about the neighboring system that ranchers use, or they had no frame really that they had. And then participants were able to ask for help or give help to a partner. And what we found was that this need-based transfer framing, regardless of whether it was the au sautoir framing or the rancher framing, led people to give more, to make larger requests, to give in a more unconditional way, to ask in a more unconditional way, and to not match the amounts given and received as much as they did when there was no framing. And to us, this really strongly suggests that this sort of need-based transfer of repertoire is very easy to elicit just by sort of giving some, some social cultural information, right? Like, oh, hey, people are doing this. And then people just kind of jump into that way of behaving. And to me, that then kind of like links back with the fact that, the Maasai call au sautoir and sile, and the fact that, like, with the computational models, it is a coordination game where, right, like, if you can both be or all be playing in a need-based transfer way, everybody does better, but you need to all be on the same page that that's what you're doing. So then it would make sense that some cultural information that can kind of like nudge you in that direction, that you should pay attention to that and then act accordingly. Now, I mentioned at the beginning that, need-based transfers are not just something that happen in humans, but they also happen in other species. So many of you are probably familiar with the work that was done on vampire bats, and what was found was basically that that these bats were sharing with bats that they had previously helped. So the assumption was made then that, like, well, what's going on is reciprocity. But actually, if you look at the original data, the biggest predictor of helping is the hunger or the weight, the low weight of the recipient bat. So this is actually an example of need-based transfers as well, the way that vampire bats share. So in social insects, there are many ants that do a behavior called trophallaxis, where you'll have ants that go out foraging, they come back to the nest, and they're ants that have been at the nest who are hungry because they haven't been out foraging. And they will literally tap the antennae of ants that are coming back that are full, have eaten a lot, and to request food. And then the ant that had its antenna tapped, if it has enough, then it regurgitates for the ant that's in need. So this is, another example where you have a request, right? And you have a response with this need-based transfer structure. You also have the same kind of structure here in the evolution of multicellularity, where when you got to a certain point in terms of, aggregations of cells, it wasn't possible for nutrients and oxygen to get from the outside to the inside just through diffusion. So you need to have some sort of active system of transport. And that is sort of the seed that eventually gave rise to all of the sort of, digestive systems and circulatory systems and all of that we have, where you have nutrients and resources getting distributed to the cells that need them, that don't otherwise have access to them, right? And so you could think about a multicellular body as a very sophisticated need-based transfer machine, right? That is taking many, many different kinds of resources and having certain cells that are sort of responsible for processing them, and then having these systems set up that get the nutrients to where they need to go. So let me see where I am on time here. I'll maybe give you guys a few more slides and then just open it up for general discussion here. Oh, actually, I see some comments. All right, so why don't I give you guys just a little bit more of this stuff about managing large scale risk, and then we'll just open it up to chat in 2 or 3 minutes here. So right now, just, being very frank, this is the question that I am probably the most interested in, which is, can we actually use need-based transfer systems to provide decentralized insurance where markets can't? So very interested in this question. I'm also interested, and I'll just add this on here, in the question of, how can we actually work together collectively to envision, ways of managing collective risk, because there are a lot of risks that we don't just face as individuals, right? We face like large scale risks that we have to manage collectively. So I think these are some of the most important questions that we have to ask right now in our world. And I think that need-based transfer systems have a lot of strengths for really kind of jumping in where insurance can't. So one is that you can have need-based transfers providing sort of informal insurance without needing actuarial data, right? You don't need to have a long history of previous events to know how likely they are and how severe they are to price insurance, which is what you need for market insurance, right? You need to figure out how much it's going to cost. But with need-based transfer relationships, you basically just create a relationship with someone where you agree that you'll help them out and they'll help you out if you're able to, without going below what you need. And so it's not as data intensive, which also means that it's a little bit more flexible to be used in situations where it might not be possible to really price insurance easily. One of the biggest advantages, I think, of the need-based transfer systems is that not only do they function well in the face of uncertainty, but they actually seem specifically designed for situations where there is sort of an uncertainty, there's uncontrollability. That's where we see people behaving in this need-based transfer kind of way, when the kinds of things that happen are uncertain, right? So as opposed to, markets where market-based insurance, where it can be very difficult to deal with the uncertainty, need-based transfer systems are a sort of more informal system that actually seems designed for that. We also know that people will spontaneously help each other when disasters occur, and they do this without expecting to get paid back. And sometimes they'll do it on very large scales without expecting to get paid back. Like, for example, in the aftermath of, the 1904 San Francisco earthquake, people were unbelievably cooperative, including, companies like that ran the transportation system were just like, all rides are free. Supermarkets were giving away everything that they could, and eventually things kind of, went back to market-based norms. But we do know that this is something that happens, that people will jump in and be really helpful when there's a disaster. And I think another thing that's really exciting about need-based transfer relationships is that they can begin with just simply dyadic relationships, one-on-one relationships, where people just say, hey, I'll be there for you, you'll be there for me, like I'm on your apocalypse team or whatever, right? You can just decide that. You don't actually need to get everybody to shift over to a new set of norms. And in fact, you don't need to shift away completely from other norms either, right? We know that the Maasai, they have a system that is a debt credit system that they use, and then they have the Osotwa system that they use, and they use them in different contexts. So I think it's a sort of, it's empowering, and it doesn't have to threaten a lot of the existing structures that are out there. And there are, I think there's also some benefits that come from the fact that need-based transfers are based on relationships that can provide psychological benefits. But, from a very economic perspective, some people might say, well, maintaining relationships is really costly, right? And it's cheaper to kind of have market-based transactions with just generalized trust. So, some interesting things to sort of think about and work out. I have a lot more that I could tell you guys about like some hybrid systems that kind of already exist in the world with like need-based transfers and market-based principles, and some other examples from the field. But I think right now I'm going to just put on my my acknowledgement slides here, and then we can have discussion so that we have time for that. So thanking, all of my collaborators and wonderful students and groups that I've worked with over the years. This is a, non-exhaustive list really of all the folks who've been a part of our work. So thank you all of them, and thank you to all of you for listening, and I look forward to the discussion.
That's amazing.
Well, thank you.
Let's get back into gallery view here.
Super talk, Athena.
Oh,
Wow.
thank
Super
you.
talk. Yeah. So my policy is I never ask the first question. I always ask the fourth question. So please line up so I can ask a question.
Andy.
Athena, have you read Rutger Bregman's book, Humankind?
I'm not sure if I've read that.
I think you'll love it, by the way. It's
okay, great.
But one of the things, so Rutger Bregman is a Dutch historian who looked at, among other things, like what happened during the London Blitz. So the Nazis are raining bombs down on London, and the theory among Nazi generals was that this would destroy the British will to resist and cause them to become part of the Reich. Turns out the adversity brought Londoners closer together, and many Londoners who basically abandoned reciprocity-based relationships for need-based transfers. Basically, everybody would run to help whoever was hit by the bombs or whoever needed to be kept safe. And that and after the Blitz ended, many of the people who were who had to live through the bombing said that they never felt as much a kinship and closeness to their fellows as others. In other words, the switch to a need-based transfer system was fulfilling to them at an emotional level in ways that, ordinary everyday existence in a capitalist society isn't.
Yeah.
Wow. Yeah. I'd love to take a look at that. Thanks for the suggestion.
There's so many other examples of that too. Paradise Built in Hell is another book
Yeah,
that,
I love that book. That's one of my favorite books, really.
yeah, so, Declan.
Hi, first of all, thank you so much, Athena, for the presentation. I learned a lot from it. I'm very interested in the same question that you asked right at the very end of whether need-based transfer systems can sort of replace or do the work that we currently have, like insurance systems doing right now with the risk pooling in a way. One of my biggest things is I think obviously humans are made and we've sort of evolved to cooperate on these smaller scale levels. And so I think that's one of the biggest areas that is the difficulty to this. Do you recommend, like, or would you, what is the route to creating a need-based transfer system that would replace sort of a current insurance system, for example? That would you recommend that it be on a local, like small, like neighborhood scale, or would it be somehow on a larger scale? And how would we like overcome in that way the lack of sort of local trust that's sort of used as like the social capital that is sort of needed for those kind of systems to thrive?
Great questions. And I think yes and yes. You know, I think we need to both have local networks and then figure out how do we scale those up. And if you look at Fijians, I didn't have the chance to go into that much depth on them, but I'll tell you a little bit more about them and how they can potentially be used as an example, which is this carry system that they have. It is based on everybody within a village can carry anybody else within that same village. So that's kind of the main carry system. But then they have dyadic carry relationships that are village to village relationships. Now, if you look at the sort of structure of the risk that they face, you see the main risk that they face is from cyclones. And when a cyclone hits, it hits the whole village pretty much, you know, at once. And so in order to manage that risk, you can't just have connections within a village. You have to have connections, you know, that are between villages. And they will maintain these relationships with other villages in a very ritualistic kind of way. They have the chiefs will come together. They will exchange these whale teeth that are wrapped in rope, and the whale teeth like represent the weight of the relationship, and the rope, you know, represents the strength. And they you know will share these with each other. And so they're building these relationships with other villages that they can then rely on in times of need. And I think what has happened there, if I can speculate for a minute, is that over time, the system has really adapted to the fact that the scale of risk can best be managed through relationships that are village to village, that have this, you know, this sort of dyadic structure. And then within villages, it's people aren't keeping, you know, those they're not sort of putting the investment on the individual relationships as much. They're just sort of doing it in a set-based way. Oh, if you're a part of this, you know, village, then you and I carry for our day-to-day needs. Now, if you think about an example, I would love this example from sort of more modern societies, which is you've probably heard of sister cities programs. They're, you know, these cultural exchanges usually for young people to go from, you know, one city to the other. For example, Phoenix and Chengdu in China had a relationship, have a relationship of the sister cities. And when you had, I believe it was an earthquake that happened in Chengdu, if I'm remembering correctly, there was a huge outpouring of support from the Phoenix community. And it's not actually part of sister cities arrangement that they help each other in times of disaster. But the fact that they had built this relationship, it just spontaneously led to this desire to help the other whole city, right, in a time of need. So I think that, you know, if we are sort of purposeful about how we are building these relationships that are not just among individuals, but also among higher level entities, that, you know, that our natural desire to help when we can, and when somebody that we have a connection with is in need, that can bubble to the surface, right? If we have sort of the right roads, the right paths that can sort of come out through that are already built in terms of those relationships. So those kinds of things make me optimistic that there are ways that we could scale these up. But I think, we need to look more at those kinds of examples. Where those things, happen spontaneously. And also when they happen in a more sort of regulated way, like you do have airlines that have contractual relationships with each other where they will give each other heavily discounted seats if bad weather or equipment failure happens that's uncontrollable and they need to reroute passengers. So if you've ever been rerouted on another airline, it's because airlines will have these relationships with each other where they're basically agreeing that they're not do market transfers. Instead, they're going to give each other seats for heavily discounted rates in order to help each other manage risk, right? And so that's something that developed sort of within a capitalist system, but in order to help manage that risk. So those kinds of examples are really intriguing to me, and I think they suggest that there is a lot of potential for that. We just, I think, need to be a little bit more deliberate about trying to understand how those work, and then trying to set things up so that those things can sort of naturally bubble up when the opportunities arise, for us to help each other and help manage risk.
That's brilliant. Awesome. I hadn't heard that before, but so you're basically saying as the size of the calamity increases, we're scaling that with the size of the organizations and groups that are collaborating to help each other in that system. I like that a lot.
Yeah. Depending on the scale at which the risks occur, right? It's you want to have partners that don't have highly correlated risks with yours. And in fact, we have a bunch of other results. I didn't have a chance to talk about them, because there just wasn't enough time today, but that, really need-based transfer systems give you the biggest benefit when you don't have risks that are highly correlated, which is pretty intuitive, but it follows, in the models that we've done.
I love that. Thank you so much.
Leano.
Okay, great talk. Really liked it a lot. I have a couple of questions. So first of all, mathematically, whenever you have more and smaller risk pools, you always have higher cost and worse outcomes.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And that's pools of the same kind,
Mm-hmm.
right, within a society. So I'm wondering, have you tested whether or not adding the debt version on top of the need-based version reduces the effect of the need-based version?
If you have both sort of operating at the same time,
Right.
that's an interesting idea. I hadn't thought about it, but it would be, it wouldn't be that hard to say, create a simulated environment where some things are more predictable to the agents and some things are less predictable, and allow the agents to sort of, toggle which rule they're going to be using for their expectations about repayment, and explore, how those might evolve, and the preferences for sort of using those might evolve. So yeah, I mean, I think it's absolutely doable. It just hasn't been done yet.
Yeah, no, that would be a really interesting thing, because that's basically answering the question: do we need to have a monetary system or not?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, one of the things that you do get, with the debt-based monetary, market-based kind of system is you get efficiency. You can do lots of transactions quickly because you can transact with anybody, regardless of whether you have an existing relationship. And also, you don't necessarily develop a relationship by having a transaction. With the no-sautoir system, or these need-based transfer systems, they happen often in existing relationships, and if they happen in a situation where you don't already have a relationship, then you're establishing a relationship. And so it's, I think it's very satisfying for us as humans to have those relationships, needs-based transfer relationships where we can rely on others, but also they take time and energy. And I think they can get crowded out when the possibility of, making a lot of money quickly is present. So it'd be interesting to kind of think about, well, how to put all of those pieces in a way that could allow us to ask some of those questions.
Yeah, I think that would be really, really cool. I'd be interested in working on something like that. That's really, really cool.
Very cool. And Exmond, I see you have a great example here. I'd be very curious to know which cyclone disaster that was, because I mean, I agree, like these, market insurance systems, like they can't really deal with a lot of what we're facing now. And we do need to think about, how we can make our societies more resilient by, building in these capacities for risk management.
I think it also needs to be said, I'm jumping the queue here with a different comment, that in these cases of emergencies and this extraordinary helping that takes place, it is also the case that the profiteering begins immediately. That in addition to the helping and the upwelling of support, you do have a fraction of people that just exploit it from the very beginning. So we haven't solved the exploitation problem, and then we could give as many examples of profiteering from emergencies as helping in emergencies. I think that's an important thing to keep in mind.
That is really
absolutely. I would consider our current inflation to be one of those situations where our parasites are taking advantage of the situation. So I was wondering, everything that you said made perfect sense to me, especially in light of David Graeber's book, Debt, the First 5,000 Years. Have you read?
Oh, you mean Debt, the First 5,000 Pages?
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, that book. Yeah, that book.
Okay. So yeah, this was awesome. I'm wondering, have you modeled it with different levels? Like, for example, I mean, like in our current system, what we're trying to get to in some senses is a system where we risk pool everybody and we collectively manage the funds for it. And that would probably need to be scaled in the same way as you talked about for the villages. So you'd have to scale it to different levels, to different sizes, to different areas. Perhaps it would be watersheds rather than particular populations or something like that. But have you modeled it with that kind of a web of different levels working together?
So I haven't done that modeling, but a colleague of mine, Dieter Armbruster, actually created a need-based transfer-based model where you had sort of environments that had, different productivity and variability and stuff, and allowed, these need-based transfer networks to kind of emerge and arise there. So there are people who are, working on some of those questions. And I think you're absolutely right that, you do need a sort of multi-level kind of system, and just practically speaking, having things like cooperative extension systems that like land grant universities had, which really, I mean, a lot of now they're not really as focused on disaster preparedness as, but they used to really be about like how to help households and communities manage the risk that comes with living in frontiers. Now they're, mostly kind of focused on like agricultural helping, helping people who have farms and such, but they used to really be there for risk management. And I think that if government funding, for cooperative extension programs and other kinds of things would really come in with the goals of helping households to be prepared, and also helping communities to build these need-based transfer networks, that would be a great place, just practically speaking, to start. And all of us actually benefit from everybody having basic disaster preparedness, right? Because then if there is a real, acute crisis, if it's a wildfire or a flood or another pandemic, right? Then any government level help that comes in or higher, any, even NGOs and, charities, et cetera, they're able to go to where the need is most acute and not have to also deal with a humanitarian crisis of, say people not having food and water in their houses or basic medical supplies. So I think that there are a lot of things that, actually are very easy and practical that we can start with if we want to be proactive about managing risk and helping to develop these networks. Yeah.
Okay, Jordan.
All right. Well, thank you so much for this was really fascinating. Marx was brought up in the chat, and so I've been thinking about this idea related to kind of, we've for a long time progressive people have been focused on and Marx was focused on labor as the unit to like organize labor unions, right? These collectives of around human work. And I've been thinking a while, the last few years, in conjunction with stuff I'm learning from pro-social, of just how with AI and technology and just different variation in human capabilities, that organizing around labor seems unsustainable and like just not a way forward. So I've had this idea of human unions rather than labor unions. And human unions is basically maybe hunter-gatherer tribes, right? A group of humans who are just doing this in need-based transfer kind of way of being. Anyway, so this is exciting to hear, and because I've had these ideas of, I'm a therapist, but I'm like starting a nonprofit where we're doing some pro-social and community stuff and trying to address mental health and people feeling lonely and disconnected at a local level. And I've been trying to figure out how to start up these human unions where just a group of 2, 3, 4, 5 people can kind of get together and observing their own boundaries and limits, but also kind of figuring out what each other's need, even if that's just someone to listen to them, someone to validate them and things like that. Anyway, this is really connecting with me, and I'm grateful for your research you're doing. And what's my question in this? Oh, part of it is I've thought about universal basic income and this idea of organizing humans at the level of just being alive, being a human, rather than at the level of labor. And I'm wondering how universal basic income fits into this. If we scaled up this kind of ethic of a need-based transfer, would that inevitably result in a kind of universal basic income, or would it just be this ground up kind of thing and you wouldn't need something like that from a more centralized place?
I think it could be either way, honestly. It could be that, with really strong need-based transfer systems and, reasonable economy, right? That you might not necessarily need something like universal basic income. But I do think that the idea of universal basic income is one way to kind of instantiate this idea that people should, not be below their threshold for sort of what they need in order to survive. And, collectively sort of managing that risk as a, large human community, right? That's kind of the idea of universal basic income, would be, getting people just to that threshold of, sort of what's needed to survive. I think it could also potentially be done, without having it be a top-down process. But yeah, the top-down process does kind of represent a certain kind of way of scaling that up, if that makes sense.
Do you feel like a top-down process prevents the needed local or micro level relationships that benefit societies?
That's a great question. I think that, I'm not going to say it would prevent it, but it certainly would mean that you wouldn't have the need for those micro level relationships for the purpose of managing that risk, right? Of having enough income from month to month. There might be other risks that, you know, you do need those relationships for, but yeah, certainly it could take care of some of those risks in a sort of, you know, centralized way.
Yeah. Okay. So I have 2 points to make. And the first one, if I could reel you back to one of your earliest slides, Athena, of the kind of costs and benefits of group size. Could you bring that
Yeah.
back up?
You bet.
So I wanted to think about two alterations of the slide. This is a very general comment, and then I'll follow with a more specific one. On challenges, I think there's challenges of coordination in addition to cheater
Yeah,
detection.
I agree. Absolutely. There are.
Just
for sure.
even if everyone is willing, there's challenges of coordination. And then for opportunities, it's not the case that bigger is always better. I think often there's an optimal group size for all of these things. Division, and very often the optimal group size is some number. And if you go beyond it, then all your coordination and you get all your costs, and you don't get additional benefits. So I mean, this is the concept of polycentric governance, that every sphere of activity has an optimal scale. Eleanor Ostrom showed that forensic labs, those could be statewide, but as far as cops walking the beat, that has to be a neighborhood scale, and so on and so forth. So I just kind of wanted to plant the seed of what would this graph look like if you, first of all, had coordination and in addition to challenges, and then in many cases, have the opportunities be not just something which always increases with scale, but sometimes has an optimal scale. So that was a global comment, and we could go back. You can get rid of the slides now for my next comment. So for my next, first of all, would you like to comment on that, and then I'll proceed to my next?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I mean, I think that you're absolutely right. This, you know, is a sort of a schematic to represent like a sort of just the big picture that, you know, as groups increase, there are benefits that you can get, but there are also costs. And of course, many other things happen. And you're absolutely right that there are a lot of situations where the optimal group size is not infinite, right? Like the optimal group size is some finite number, and that might be different when it comes to those different potential benefits and different costs. Yes, coordination absolutely is one of the other challenges that's there, and it might be more important than, you know, detecting and suppressing cheating in a lot of contexts as well, in the sense that, you know, the amount of sort of, you know, metabolism and attention, like that goes, for example, to like having a multicellular body be viable, there's probably a lot more that goes on in terms of the coordination, right? You think of all the signaling systems, all the transfer systems, all of that, than just the cheater detection systems, like the, you know, the cancer, you know, monitoring and suppression systems. Probably the coordination stuff is bigger. So yeah, I think you're right that, you know, that is a very much a simplification, that slide that I showed.
Thanks. And the more I think about this, the main topic that you have of need-based transfer, the more I'm of the opinion that it does require a normative structure that in the first place makes people very reluctant to trigger it. And I know in the ethnographic examples I know, people hate to say that they're in need. They'll become really in need before they fall upon the kindness of strangers. That's kind of shameful for them, and also that if you're in a position of wealth in a community and you don't give in a situation like that, then that's shameful for you. And so all of this is public and monitored, and so the social control is not taking place in the narrow sense of the partners within it. It's not like a reciprocal relationship that way. But boy, oh boy, is it ever in existence at a larger scale. And I think that it's telling that it's in the superorganisms, it's in the multicellular organisms and the social insect colonies that need-based transfer becomes the norm. Isn't that interesting? So it seems to me that if we actually did have a strong normative structure in human society so that you really couldn't exploit it by virtue of these reputational mechanisms and monitoring and so on, then it's at that point that it really becomes safe and efficient to do it that way. So, so that I think provides a hint as to how to implement it in in a modern context. Just make sure that those norms are in place so that you really, anyhow.
Yeah, there's a lot of there's some variation that we saw across our field sites too with this. So with OSO 12, people won't really talk about the OSO 12 transfers that happened. So that's private information. So that happens, you know, and people won't really say, these are my OSO 12 partners, this is what happened. So we don't have any data actually on like the networks and what people have transferred, because that's something you don't ask and talk about. So I think that, you know, that's getting reflected there. With Carrie, you know, this happens sort of in the context of this sort of sacred relationship. In Appalachia, in rural Kentucky, we have a field site there too. And there people will not ask for help, but they might say, for example, you know, I'm planning on digging my septic this weekend, you know, and people will know, oh, that's a job that requires help. And then they'll offer to help. But people won't say, hey, would you help me? At least that's what they reported in the, you know, qualitative field work that we did. So and in you know, among the ranchers here in New Mexico and in Arizona, they're sort of key people in the community that often will notice that there is a need, and then they will tell others that there's a need and sort of help coordinate to get the help there, because you know, asking for the help is not necessarily something that people are explicitly doing. So I think you're right that, you know, it can manifest in many different ways, and oftentimes it's not through an explicit like, hey, I really need help, you know, me asking you directly.
Yeah.
There are these sort of circuitous routes to it.
Yeah, really interesting. Hey, Rachel.
Hi. So, Athena, I have so many things going through my head that I'm almost having a hard time formulating my question that I'm curious about. But I primarily work at the community level with coalitions that represent lots of different organizations. And one thing that I noticed that you were talking about, and I think this is that part of that slide that David asked you to reference, the scaling up. One thing that I'm thinking about is when you're talking about individual to individual, there's a cultural norm, which is that normative component, but also the individual agency to be able to give, to be able to say yes. So when somebody is representing an organization in a coalition, and the goal is to get the coalition to work in a pro-social manner so that they can be cooperative, right, to accomplish this larger goal, whether it's watershed protection, or I'm thinking about this one project I'm working on right now with the health department. It's coordinating all the providers in the community that work on suicide, adverse childhood experiences, and overdose. And they're having a terrible time. Well, and that's why they called me in, to get them to be able to work together, because they don't have the capacity nor the funding. So I guess what I'm thinking about and wondering about is how do you transfer what you've learned to kind of this group level? And the only example that I know of, my brother-in-law in early days of the pandemic works for a drug company, and Bristol Myers Squibbs, and he said it was the most incredible thing that all of them in research came together across competing companies to work together to solve the vaccine problem. And it's the first time he has ever seen that in his 30 years of working on melanoma and lung cancer, like these really big things. So it gets me thinking about, does the need have to be so great, or does it have to be incredibly universal? Is it for the right, you know, where it's really affecting the individual? Because I really
That's a
want
great question.
Because I really want these organizations to work together, because it is affecting individuals, right? The individual anyway. So
Yeah.
I think I'm trying to take from what you're teaching to be able to implement.
Yeah. Well, So I think that you're right that when there's an acute need, an acute disaster, right? Something that is happening that everybody can see is happening, that does often help mobilize people to cooperate without kind of expecting anything for it, right? They'll just, okay, this is just what we have to do. And then we can ask, well, why is that, right? And there, I think, are a couple of different reasons why that might be the case. One possibility is that when those bad events like that happen, maybe we all recognize our vulnerability a little bit more, and that makes us willing to engage in this active relationship building and working together, that also will help us manage future risk, right? So it could be that it's making us aware of that sort of vulnerability. It could also be that it makes us more aware of our interdependence, right? And how we really have to rely on each other, and that there might be really no way of solving the problems without working together, and that, I can only really do well if you also do well. So picking apart, like, what are the roles of, those different variables, I think is really important to do. But one thing that we did find, and this is, data I didn't show you guys, but we actually did this study during the pandemic, looking at people's willingness to cooperate, how much they endorse need-based transfer norms, and also of their feelings of interdependence. And what we found is that people who, that overall there was sort of like a decrease in cooperation and endorsing cooperative norms. Maybe there was a little bump at the beginning, and then it kind of slowly went down. There was an increase, though, in people's feeling of interdependence. And for people who had higher ratings of interdependence, feeling more interdependent with their neighborhoods and communities, the cooperation for them didn't go down as much as it did for people who had ratings overall feeling lower interdependent. So we think there's something important going on there, where those feelings of interdependence might really be buffering against the sort of, cooperation fatigue that otherwise might occur, when you do have sort of these slow burn kinds of disasters. So that's something that we're actively, exploring now, to, try to look at these, what's really going on in terms of these variables and how they're affecting people's willingness to cooperate.
Great. Thanks.
Yeah. I kind of have a love-hate relationship with evolutionary psychology, at least of the Cosmides 2B variety. But in this case, it seems like this response is, really seems deeply innate, like a module for it or something like that. It's just part
I don't like modules, but I like a need-based transfer module.
Yeah, I mean, so have you thought much about that? That, this really is something that's just, and that makes you want to look. I mean, you are studying what you're mostly showing with your cross-cultural studies is cross-cultural similarities.
Yeah.
A little bit unlike the wonderful work of Joe Henrich with the ultimatum game, showing a lot of cultural variation. Now there'll be cultural variation here too as well, but anyhow, I wanted to spend just a couple of minutes on kombucha. So Jordan has a question, but then tell us a little bit about, the whole, because this is ecosystem level selection. This is close to microbiomes. The idea that whole communities can be adaptive units is just a great topic. We'll invite you back for that, but if you could just give us a taste. And first Jordan, and I also want to introduce next week's speakers. So I get the last 3 minutes.
Great.
Jordan.
I'll be quick here. Are there any dangers of need-based transfer systems that come out as antisocial behavior?
Sure.
So are you asking whether there are aspects of sort of need-based transfer behavior that can be like negative and bad for people?
Yeah, kind of like how we talk about cooperation can be pro-social, but cooperation could be also cooperation to commit genocide, right?
Yeah. Okay. So, anytime you have a situation where, like you said, individuals could cooperate to commit genocide, or you could have, cells in a multicellular body that are turning cancerous, they're sharing resources with each other. Or you have, bacteria or other parasites that are, many individuals, right, that are inside the body, and they, maybe are coordinating, sharing resources or information in a need-based way. So absolutely, need-based transfers could be weaponized, right, to, basically have cooperators use them to exploit outside groups or hosts or others that they might be sort of wanting to take advantage of, for sure. Yeah.
Well, I mean, we have examples with pastoralist societies such as the Maasai segmented societies where the units will compete with each other until there's a common threat, and then they very easily join forces to and cooperate in the face of a common threat. Well, first, let me advertise next week's speaker. Most of you are familiar with donut economics, and the face of donut economics is Kate Rayworth. But Kate's organization, the Donut Economics Action Lab, has a co-founder. That person is Carlotta Sanz Ruiz, and she's responsible for, I think, a lot of the organizational aspects of donut economics. And so next week we're featuring Carlotta in a talk that's titled Donut Economics from a Radical Idea to Transformative Action. So this is how to put some of these ideas into action. So I'm really looking forward to that talk. And we do have a nice relationship with donut economics. That'll be next Friday at 12 because she'll be dialing in from the UK. So Athena,
Kombucha. Well, I'll be very happy to give you a taste. So one of the things that I'm sort of most excited about our work on kombucha right now is I have a graduate student. Her name is Giselle Marquez Alcaraz, and she has been working on looking at sort of what happens when kombucha is grown with different proportions of sort of initial starter and with different potential invaders or different amounts of potential invaders coming in. And this grew out of a study that we did several years ago where we took hand swabs at citizen science event, and we put them in kombucha and we put them in sweet tea. So the way that you brew kombucha is you start with like 80% sweet tea and 20% kombucha. Then usually you put a biofilm on top called a SCOBY. And then you sort of let that ferment. And so we did this study where we took hand swabs, we put them in the sweet tea, we put them in the kombucha, and we looked over 30 days at what happened. The kombucha with the hand swabs, not only did it look like normal kombucha, and the sweet tea looked disgusting, but when we sequenced it, what we found was that the microbial community in the kombucha with the hand swabs was really a stable ecosystem over time, while the one with the sweet tea was basically got overtaken, much less diversity and massive changes in both the bacterial and fungal composition over time. And as we were doing this study, we saw, and this was really just a sort of like an offhand observation that one of my previous research assistants really like pointed out, because we were just kind of like observing, and he was like, no, this is something actually really important, which is the kombuchas that had the hand swabs in them, the scobies that they made on top. So the scobies will sort of spontaneously generate on the top. They're a biofilm. It's sort of made with cellulose that comes from the way that the bacteria and yeast are processing the sugars, and they'll basically make this biofilm. When you put the hand swabs in, it seemed like they were making what looked like a healthier biofilm than the ones that didn't have the hand swabs in them. And we're like, that's weird, right? Like, why would that happen? Where they'd look better, right, when you're putting nasty stuff in them. And this led us to hypothesize that there might actually be something like a multi-species immune system in kombucha, where when you have these invaders, there is some response, might actually be very, very local, that's happening, where the bacteria and yeast are producing, like small amounts of this biofilm to essentially like encapsulate potential invaders. And if that is happening, then that actually might be part of what gives rise to this biofilm that that then sort of creates this actual barrier on the top that prevents things from coming in from the outside, and also can kind of like double as a resource storage as well. So now we're looking more systematically at this hypothesis, varying the initial amounts of kombucha, trying to look at different invaders. And I would encourage you to invite Giselle to come and talk about this work, maybe in 6 months or a year, because we
In
have
the fall series. We'll invite her to the fall series. Do you connect this to microbiome research? I mean, this is a microbiome, but
yeah, well, so
microbiomes that exist within hosts, multicellular hosts.
So we, in terms of our motivation for like using kombucha as a model system, some of that comes from the fact that like, I think that it's actually a decent model system for our microbiome, better than a lot of other model systems in a way, because you have diverse, yeast and bacteria in there. They're processing materials sort of on an ongoing basis, right? And materials are kind of coming out and coming in. And we know that, the lining of our guts, on the sort of inside, you do have biofilms that are partially created by microbes that have some protective function. It's probably interacting with our own immune system. So I think there's a lot of potential there, and I see it as a system that has a lot of features that can
A beautiful system. It's like a microbiome without the host. So
yeah, and it's so easy to study in the lab, and and also like for students to study, to bring to classrooms. Like I think there's just so much potential for it that is as of yet untapped, so to speak. So
awesome. Well, how fun was this? This is another one of these life, the universe, and everything talks, and so such a joy.
thank you so
everyone.
much for inviting me.
And so until next week, join us next week for another great one. Thank you.